Oyez, oyez, oyez. Anyone having business before the King's Justice of the Superior Court of Justice, attend now and you shall be heard. Long live the King, the Honorable Justice Hennessy presiding. You may be seated.
Good morning, all.
Sure. Just one item of housekeeping before we get started. Mr. Schachter yesterday kindly pointed out that the 1975 document we were discussing on slide 68 should be entered as an exhibit. We have already provided electronic copies to the court, which was provided yesterday, and to our friends, which was provided by email last week. We ran into difficulties printing copies that we did not expect, despite the intrepid efforts of our law clerk. So we will be providing hard copies next week. But the document, I think would it be Exhibit 68?
Correct.
So the full formal title of the document is Report.
Oh, but we're not going to enter it. Or you want to enter it electronically?
Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
If
So
this makes sense. Okay.
As long as I get it.
yeah, we will bring the hard copies. We just ran into unexpected printer issues.
Is the electronic copy, did you remove the blank pages?
No.
Oh. All right, the pagination is just going to be different. All right.
Sorry, it's we received it in a very unfortunate form where there's a page and then a blank page and then a page and then a blank page.
Oh, throughout the whole thing?
Throughout the whole thing. Someone, I don't think, scanned it quite correctly. So Exhibit 68 would be entitled Report of the Timber Revenue Task Force to the Treasurer of Ontario and the Minister of Natural Resources. And the date on the document is October 1975. So we ask that that be entered as Exhibit 68.
October 1975.
Correct.
Got it.
Professor Smart, yesterday we finished slide 75, so if we could start at slide 76.
So you have to select which screen you choose to share.
Okay.
No, it's not. I'm just gonna do one of them. Okay.
And could we make it full screen? Professor, could you please tell us about slide 76?
We will continue to talk about the alleged inaccuracy in the public accounts, which led Mr. Hutchings to change his approach in 1945. In support of his view that the PAO is inaccurate, Mr. Hutchings testified about an example in our post-1945 data in which the share of the Ministry of Natural Resource expenses that we include in our accounts rose sharply for the years 2012 to 2019. We agree that that does happen in our data. We want to be clear that In raising this issue, we don't believe Mr. Hutchings is alleging that we made any error here. He's just restating his claim that the PAO data don't have enough accuracy to perform the calculations. He'd like more detail. That may be true. We don't disagree. We would like more detail as well. Regardless, we use the most detailed data that were available for that program in those years. If there were any change in the portion of those expenses that were included in our NCR accounts, it would have no impact on our estimated value of augmented annuities. I will explain why that is true later in my testimony, but we talked about it at the end of testimony yesterday.
When you said those expenses, do you mean the expenses that Mr. Hutchings identified for the years 2012 to 2019 for the MNRF?
Yes,
Sorry, what was that acronym?
Oh, MNRF, yes. What is MNRF?
it's the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry, which during those years was the official name of the ministry that we've been talking
Okay.
about.
One of the MNR's ancestors, which may not even be the MNR anymore.
Successors. I frankly do not know the current name. It's longer than that.
Okay,
But in all cases, we're talking about the main resource ministry of the Ontario government.
thank you.
Yes, the names do change occasionally, and perhaps more than occasionally.
So the point you're making is, I believe, a point that has been made many times. Mr. Hutchings says there's not enough data, so he takes this average that he applies. You say you don't disagree that there's not great data, but you say whatever data there is, we're going to perform our calculations using that data and the inferences you take from it. But is there any other point on this slide? Or you're coming to the conclusion that had there been better data, it would have made no impact on your estimated values? Is that what you're saying?
On your last question, yes, Your Honor, I am saying that it would have no impact on the value of annuities. On your earlier question, no, I do not agree that there are not enough data or not detailed enough data to perform these calculations. I don't agree with that. I do agree it would be better to have more detail than the PAO gives us. And if we had more detail, I would have more confidence in the accuracy of our estimates. But I have reasonable confidence in the accuracy of the estimates. I am attempting to respond to all the specific critiques that Mr. Hutchings offered, even in cases such as this, where it has no bottom line impact, in order to explain to the court what we're all doing here.
Okay, thank you.
Tell us about slide 77.
Another of the points raised by Mr. Hutchings regarded resource access roads. In his reply report of October and in his testimony, Mr. Hutchings stated, and he stated repeatedly, different places in different documents in his testimony, he stated that we included spending on the Northern Roads program for the period 1978 to 1986. We agree with Mr. Hutchings that that program may include spending that primarily benefits non-resource road users, and we don't wish to include it. But Mr. Hutchings' statement that we included that for the period 1978 to 1986, on which he was explicit, that statement is not correct. So I will now spend a few minutes explaining the issue and showing you that Mr. Hutchings is wrong. The background is that in 1980, there was a change in the PAO accounting for the roads programs run by the then Northern Affairs Department, which became the Ministry of Northern Development and Mines, so one of the resource ministries. In those accounts, we believe that what happened was there were two programs, Resource Access Roads and Northern Roads. Beginning in 1980, we believe they were consolidated into a single program, so that we wish to include a portion of it, but not all of it. As a method of apportionment, what we did was to include the total of the two, but only for 2 years. only for the years 1980 and 1981. We did not include northern roads for the years 1978 or 79, or for any of the years after 1981, contrary to what Mr. Hutchings stated. Now, Mr. Hutchings provided some slides to back up his statement. A careful reader will see that all of his slides pertain to 1980, where we agree that we included northern roads.
Which you still say you should do.
We included it as a method of apportionment for this program. The notion was that we would include all of the program for 2 years and none of the program for the subsequent 5 years, and that therefore we would capture roughly 40% of the spending. It is not a precise method of apportionment by any means. In this context, it seemed like an appropriate way to handle this issue. Why do I say in this context it's appropriate? Because once again, in this context, whether I include those expenses in my NCR accounts or I do not, it only affects the cumulative NCR losses that we estimate accrued to the Crown. Under our model, it has no impact on the value of annuities.
Before we move on, you're talking about the concept of resource access roads. Does Mr. Hutchings include resource access roads in his account?
Not for these years because he decided not to use the PAO data after 1945. That being said, he does generally include mining and logging roads where they appear in the PAO up to 1945.
So do both you and Mr. Hutchings agree that resource access roads support NCRRs?
I believe they support NCRs. Mr. Hutchings did include them. I don't want to speak to the model that led him to do so.
Say, could you give me that answer again, please?
I believe that resource access roads support NCRs. My answer to Mr. Hutchings' question is affirmative on my own account. I'm not claiming to understand Mr. Hutchings' model in sufficient detail to answer for him.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Let's discuss slide 78. Please tell us about slide 78.
I want to further explain and back up my contradiction of what Mr. Hutchings said. So here is what he said. The first bullet on slide 78 includes a screenshot from his own demonstratives in which he stated, I will read the words, quote, I will highlight one key issue regarding mining expenses. Doing some ellipses for, you know what I'm doing. Boardway and SMART include certain general Northern Development roads expenditures from 1978 to 1986, incorrectly identifying them as resource access roads. Now, then on his slides, he cited and even included a screenshot of a portion of our original input data file, a raw data file that researchers that we and he, the kind of thing we and he use to do calculations for the court. He only included a screenshot of a portion of it. I here have made a new screenshot showing you all the relevant years. And I would highlight to you two things. First, the item is clearly, right, the item in question, which goes into our accounts, which was drawn from the PAO accounts, clearly identified as being resource access roads / resource development. In other words, that one line in our file includes two different programs. Did that for simply economy for our own methods. When one program ended, we might reuse the same line to capture another program. And in doing so, we were able to see more things on the screen at the same time. It made our work easier. Clearly identified as being resource access roads / resources development. I then show you the amount that we included in dollars for each year from 1978 to 1986. What is that then? It's resource access roads.
Oh, sorry, please return to slide 76. I'll let you know when we should, or 78 rather. I'll let you know when we should move on.
It is resource access roads for 2 years. Then it's Northern Roads for 2 years, based on the method of apportionment I've already described. So you can see there that the values are, in the first 2 years, 6.2 million, 7.0 million, followed by an increase to 54.3 million and 59.0 million. Those second 2 years, larger, are the combined new Northern Roads program that we included as an attempt to apportion amounts for resource access roads. The next 4 years, the amounts of 9.0 million up to, in the end, 23.8 million are the resources development program in those years. I'm now going to show you screenshots from the PAO to show that these statements are true, and that Mr. Hutchings' statement that we included Northern Roads for the years 78 through 86 is not true.
So before we get there, Professor Smart and the court, if you could just hold sort of in your mind's eye that full row that Professor Smart included from his working data that shows the values from 1978 through to 1986, just if we have a picture of that in our minds. Now, could you please put up Hutchings demonstrative slide 192? Just the next page, please. So this is the Hutchings demonstrative slide 192. Professor Smart, could you describe how the rows that we see here compare to the rows that you had included on slide 78?
So the Hutchings screenshot overlaps with the one in my deck that we just displayed. You can see the item name is the same, and you can see that he has reported the values for the years 1978 through 1981. My own screenshot then carries on to the 82 to 86 period, which is at issue right now.
Are the values in the period 82 to 86 lower than the values in the period 80-81?
Yes.
All right.
Can I just have a moment?
Oh, sorry.
please? So the point you're making, which I want to capture, is that Mr. Hutchings' slide only goes to 1981, and that your slide, sir, covers 82 to 86. Is that right?
Those
I
statements are,
wasn't able to do what Mr. Lipton told me to do, which was to keep that picture in my mind. So it's 82 to 86.
that is correct, Your Honor. The point that I'm making is simply there's full consistency between what I'm showing you and Mr. Hutchings, nothing more.
Oh, the full consistency, not the fact that there's a difference in the years 82 to 86.
Well, I wish to speak next about the years 82 to 86. And for those purposes, I displayed to you what is in my data set for those years. Mr. Hutchings did not display those years for whatever reason.
All right. And Mr. Lipton's comment was they are lower. Lower than what?
Why don't we return? So if you try to keep this picture in your mind.
Locked.
And if we return to slide 78, so here or before we
Okay.
go, we see 6 million, 7 million, 54 million, 59 million for the years 1978 to 1981.
Well, in fact, I can look at the paper version of slide 78.
Even better. So
Okay.
if you look at the paper version of slide 78, you'll see you have the values for 1978, 1979, 1980, 1981, and they're the same as on Mr. Hutchings' demonstrative slide 192.
Okay.
And then what Mr. Hutchings' demonstrative slide 192 lacks is the data from the next 5 years, 81, 82, 83, 84, 85, 86.
Right.
So the point is simply that Mr. Hutchings' demonstrative was a little selective in the data that he decided to display respecting this area.
But the significance of that selection was anything? Or are we about to hear that?
We'll talk to the court about that a little bit later,
Okay.
perhaps an argument. All right, so let's move on to slide 79.
And I'll ask for Control L again, if you please.
Please tell us about slide 79.
So I wish to contradict Mr. Hutchings in his assertion that we included northern roads for any years other than 80 and 81. And we'll simply go through a screenshot of the relevant page of the PAO for all of the other years. The first year is 1978. Court can see that we're dealing with the Ministry of Northern Affairs, that resource access road spending was $6.2 million. That's the amount that's in the relevant row of my input data, which I displayed and Mr. Hutchings displayed as a screenshot. It also shows northern roads in the very same page at $45.7 million. We did not include it. Mr. Hutchings said we did, and yet the evidence is before us all.
All right, let's turn to slide 80.
This is the very next year, 1979. We did not include it, northern roads. We did include resource access roads. This page of the PAO shows resource access road spending at 7.0 million, the same amount that's in the screenshot of our input data.
Did you include northern roads from this year?
We did not. It's also recorded here, the very previous line in the table. Mr. Hutchings said we included it. It was $49.4 million. We did not include it, and it's not in our input data.
Okay, let's go to slide 81.
The next year at issue is 1982. We did include 80 and 81. We're passing over those. We included northern roads for those years, and the amounts are larger as shown on the previous slide. For 82, Mr. Hutchings asserts that we included northern roads. We did not include northern roads. It does not occur on the same page of the PAO any longer. Indeed, I believe the name changed to Northern Transportation in that year, but we did not include that program, Northern Transportation or Northern Roads, for that year, contrary to his assertion. Instead, we included resources development as indicated in the item column of our own input file in the work papers, of which Mr. Hutchings included a screenshot. We included the item resources development. The amount for 1982 was 9.0 million in our input data. And this confirms that that is the amount for resources development from the PAO.
And so just to assist the court's understanding, if we were to look at your row of data on slide 78 for the year 1982, would it match the entry here for resource development? Would the numbers be the same?
A screenshot on page 78 for the year 1982 reads $9,043,785, corresponding exactly to the resources development amount from the public accounts currently displayed on the screen.
Let's move on to slide 82.
With Mr. Lipton's permission, I will not be quite so laborious here. Once again, in 1983, his assertion is incorrect. We included resources development, 7.2.
And slide 83.
Refers to 1984 fiscal year. We included resources development at 7.2 million, not Northern Roads.
And slide 84.
1985 fiscal year, we included resources development at 4.6 million, not Northern Roads.
And at a risk of being slightly repetitive, slide 85.
Finally, 1986, we included resources development at 23.8 million, not Northern Roads.
All right, if we can move on. That's the court's question.
No, go ahead, thank you.
To slide 86. Could you please tell us about slide 86?
Moving on to a separate issue raised by Mr. Hutchings in his reply report and his testimony. He offered the opinion that Crown forestry revenue after 1945 was small relative to GDP in the logging and wood products manufacturing sectors. GDP, of course, means statistical estimate of the sum of all incomes from those economic activities. Now, based on Mr. Hutchings' own data, it's also true that forestry expense after 1945 is small relative to GDP in the logging and wood products sectors. We agree that it's reasonable to hold the opinion that revenue and expense are small relative to GDP. I would say that this is not a critique of our methods in any sense. It's an objection to the result, that revenues were small. Ground revenues from forestry were small relative to GDP. Now, in his testimony, Mr. Hutchings went further and he advanced an entirely new argument, which was not in his reports or in his reports co-authored with Professor Stiglitz. He now has suggested that augmentation should be based on what he calls, it's a quotation, estimated Crown revenue through all channels from the forestry sector. It turns out that by that, he means including personal and corporate income taxes paid by companies and individuals working in the forestry sector. He wishes to capture a portion of those income tax revenues as Crown revenues from resources, as NCRRs in this action. However, in our opinion, income tax revenues are not revenues from resource rents.
He didn't make those calculations though, did he?
He did offer, excuse me, Your Honor, he did not offer an accounting of NCRs for the RST that included such revenues. However, in his testimony, he did offer calculations of how high those revenues were and how they should be used to offset our forestry expenses. The second point I want to make, and this will unfold over 2 or 3, maybe 4 slides. Second point I wish to make here is that, in fact, he does not estimate these Crown revenues through other channels, as he describes them. He simply takes the GDP of this logging and forest products sector, and he multiplies it by 33%. In my opinion, that's not an estimate of revenues. It's an assumption.
So before we move on to that discussion, you say that personal and corporate taxes are not revenue from resource rents. Why not?
Income in the primary resource of all parties involved in the primary resource sector includes not only resource rents, it also includes the returns to the workers and the capital employed in the primary resource sector. Income in the wood products processing or manufacturing sectors, according to conventional methods of estimation used by statistical agencies, and according to economic principle, the income in those processing sectors includes no resource rents. It's all returned to labor and capital employed in those sectors. So, because the income from which those tax revenues are derived does not include resource rents, the tax revenues themselves are not derived from resource rents.
Is that the bottom line of what you just explained? The tax revenues don't derive from resource rents. They're the return to either the worker or the investor.
It's a tax on the return to the workers or investors employed in those sectors, in contrast to things like stumpage and MPT, which we think are properly considered to be royalties, that is, Crown revenues from the rents themselves.
Professor Smart, you related that Mr. Hutchings opines that Crown forestry revenue and expenses after 1945 was small relative to GDP in the logging and wood products manufacturing industries. To your knowledge, did Mr. Hutchings perform the same analysis before 1945?
To my knowledge, he didn't report that analysis after Indeed, he did not report that analysis for any year before 1997, to my knowledge.
And do you know if Crown Forestry revenues and expenses before 1945 were also small relative to the GDP in logging and wood products manufacturing industries?
I have not examined those data.
All right, let's move on to slide 87. Can you please tell us about slide 87?
I'm going to show a few slides from Mr. Hutchings' own demonstratives in order to explain my point that Mr. Hutchings is now attempting to claim income tax revenue as NCRs. This slide from his demonstratives includes a schematic figure of the 2013 data in our accounts. The same figure does not exist in any of his reports. It's new in his trial demonstratives. In it, he is saying,
Excuse me, do you identify on this slide which slide it is of Mr. Hutchings?
yes, Your Honor, it's slide 206.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I'm not going to read all the words here, nor would, given the schematic nature of the slide, I think would it be effective to do so. I'm going to try to explain that he starts with what he calls B&S forestry expenses. So these would be the Crown expenses in support of forestry in the Bodway and Smart accounts, our accounts, at $633 million for the 2013 year. And then he shows I guess, a flow chart showing how they could be apportioned. And he includes the words, a more appropriate approach than the Bodway Smart approach would instead allocate those costs, that is the forestry expenses, in proportion to overall Crown revenues. And overall Crown revenues here should be taken to mean the direct Crown forestry revenues at $27 million. That's our forestry gross Crown revenues, and his own other so-called other Crown revenues from the forest sector. These are the income taxes based on his estimation method, and the GDP data, which he places at $1.3 billion for that particular year. And the flow chart suggests 2%, only 2% of the Bodway and Smart expenses should be allocated to the NCR account, and 98% should be allocated to this new income tax account. In the next slide, when Mr. Lipton is ready, I'm going to offer some comments on what that means.
Sorry, before we get there, just one question about this schematic on Mr. Hutchings' slide, demonstrative slide 206. Do you know if the amounts that he's listing here are nominal amounts?
I believe they are, but I have not verified those numbers.
So if they were nominal amounts, would he be committing the same, well, oh, so that's fine. They're nominal amounts. We'll leave it at that. Okay, let's move on to slide 88.
So in summary of the last, in his testimony, Mr. Hutchings suggested that 98% of Crown forestry expense for that year 2013, but other years as well, should be apportioned to his own estimated revenue from income taxes on forest products, manufacturing, and logging industries. In the process, in our opinion, he is seeking to include a large fraction of those income tax revenues and label them as NCRRs incorrectly. And to show you that what he is suggesting is equivalent to including income tax revenues and NCRs, I would like to go through this very simple mathematical example of what he's proposing.
Before you do that, do you say that Mr. Hutchings articulates that, expressly articulates that income tax revenue should be included in the calculation of NCRRs? Or that you have to infer that by his assertion that expenses should be applied against
It's
those
a,
taxes?
it's a smart question, and I can give a precise answer to it. Forgive me, Your Honor.
Okay.
That was my classroom technique coming to court, perhaps incorrectly,
Okay.
but it's a good question. What Mr. Hutching is saying is you can't include all that expense in the NCR account. You need to put it over here.
Mhm.
You asked me, is he saying we should use income tax revenues? Yes, he is. But he's saying, well, there'll be a new notional account over here, and I'll put some of the expenses there instead of the NCR account.
Mhm.
I want to show you that mathematically doing that is absolutely equivalent to taking some of the income tax revenues and putting them into the NCR account. Now, that may be self-evident, but if it's not, I'd like to show you a mathematical example that shows true.
But for some reason, he doesn't say it. You're saying that's what it means. I'm just hoping that I haven't forgotten that I didn't see that expression.
Well, if your honor wishes, we could go back one slide and you'll see precisely what Mr. Hutchings says.
Let's return to slide 87.
Okay,
He says that a more appropriate approach would instead allocate those costs, the Bodway and Smart expenses, in proportion to total Crown revenues. And the figure makes clear 98% of the Bodway Smart forestry expense is allocated to these income tax revenues.
Just while we're still here, if these are all nominal numbers, does this raise the same issue that we were discussing yesterday about using nominal numbers in arithmetic?
Formally, yes, we should always use present values, but nominal dollars of 2013 are sufficiently similar, in my opinion, to 2020 that we don't have to worry about that problem too much right now. If we were to, in other words, if we were to convert it to 2020 present values, the numbers would get larger, but not much larger.
Thank you. So let's return to slide 88.
So again, with possibly trying everyone's patience through something that's self-evident, I want to go through a simple example of what we're talking about. This is Mr. Hutchings' example, just with the numbers brought down to manageable sizes. So in my example, we now imagine that the Crown has, in a given year, $2 in stumpage revenue, $98 in income tax revenues. Obviously, the proportions here are Mr. Hutchings' asserted proportions between stumpage and these income tax revenues, 2% versus 98%. Let's also assume that the Crown has $40 in forestry expenses. That's also proportional to what Mr. Hutchings is talking about. The $633 million on his slide is roughly 40% of his combined revenues. So expenses here are 40% of combined revenues. Mr. Hutchings says only include 2% of the expenses in the NCR account and offset it against stumpage. But alternatively, he could say, well, he does not say, but I say that it would be entirely equivalent to have an NCR account, which includes all of the stumpage, $2, plus the proportional share of the income tax revenues. 40% of income tax revenues go into the NCR account. And now we deduct the $40 in expense. We can calculate NCRs from that approach. It would be the $2 in stumpage plus 40% of the income tax revenues is $39.20. Then we would deduct the $40 in expense, leaving $1.20 in net Crown revenues. That's exactly what Mr. Hutchings would get in this case. So what he does is entirely equivalent to including 40% of income tax revenues in the NCR account. In effect, he is saying, let's include enough of the income tax revenues to offset the expenses. In our opinion, income tax revenues are not direct resource revenues, and so they're not NCRs. In paragraph 10 at the beginning of Mr. Hutchings' report, he seems to accept that that's true.
When you say Mr. Hutchings' report, which report are you referring to?
The original Hutchings report, whose title I don't,
For the RST?
for the RST.
You say in paragraph 10 of Mr. Hutchings' report, he seems to accept that is true. That being, in our opinion, income tax revenues are not direct resource revenues.
He seems to accept that income tax revenues are not resource revenues.
Okay.
Did Mr. Hutchings write his report before you saw your report?
The Hutchings report that I'm talking about was written before he saw our report.
Let's move on to slide 89. Could you please tell us about slide 89?
The next 2 or 3 slides are also from Mr. Hutchings' demonstratives, and I will briefly make my second point about how he goes about constructing this so-called estimate of other Crown revenue from forestry. This figure, his slide 204, shows his estimated total Crown revenues for the period from 1997 forward. It's the green line at the top of this figure. We talked about the 2013 value of that at $1.3 billion. You can see it ranges from 2 billion up to 2.5, down and up and so on. But we're talking about the same concept for all of these years on this slide from Mr. Hutchings' demonstratives. So the question is, where does this green line come from? It includes the 2 components, the Crown forestry revenue in our accounts, plus his estimate of the income tax revenues. Now I wish to talk about where his estimate of the income tax revenues comes from.
So before we move on to that, just one question about this chart on Hutchings' demonstrative slide 204. I see the largest title on slide 204 says forest related expenses, comma, 1946 to 2019. And then I see the X horizontal axis at the bottom of the chart begins in 1997. Is it confusing to have a chart that's titled saying that it starts in 1946?
Do your best not to lead.
Sorry. Would you like to comment on that difference?
I'd like to say that the words that Mr. Lipton was just quoting are Mr. Hutchings' words, not my own. I was not confused by anything that I see on this slide. I was not confused by any of the dates I see on this slide.
Is the start date on the top in the title of the slide the same as the start date on the horizontal x-axis?
No.
Does Mr. Hutchings perform the same analysis on any expenses before 1945?
No, not to my knowledge.
All right, let's move on to slide 90.
This is Mr. Hutchings' slide 203. So we're taking him out of order, but we're trying to do justice to his argument. We will recall that on the last slide, we had a green line showing his estimated total Crown revenues, of which the key component we're trying to understand is the estimated income tax revenues from forestry. In this figure, we have Mr. Hutchings' depiction of GDP from certain sectors of the Canadian economy. This is not Ontario, but all of Canada, based on official Statistics Canada data. And in this measure of income, which will, as I'll show you, form the basis for his estimated income tax revenues, that may already be evident. Because you can see that this estimate of GDP rises and falls over the years from 1997 in the same way as his income tax revenue estimate does. We'll see why that's the case. But for now, we'll just look at the GDP and we'll see what GDP, what sectors of the economy he's measuring the GDP of here. In addition to the forestry and logging sector, the primary extraction sector that would be relevant in this case, he's added 3 additional industries in the data. I've added a big blue arrow to point everyone's attention to those. That's not Mr. Hutchings. And they're called support activities for forestry, wood product manufacturing, and paper manufacturing.
Could you please describe briefly what each of those three industries are?
Well, they're the downstream processing sectors. The last two, wood products manufacturing and paper manufacturing, are manufacturing sectors which process the raw logs, the natural resource, in order to produce manufactured products. The first of those three that I mentioned, the support activities for forestry, is different, and I'll talk about that in a minute.
Sorry, you'll talk about that.
I believe the next slide will discuss what's in support activities for forestry.
Do you use processing and manufacturing interchangeably or no? Is manufacturing after processing?
It is typical here in Canada to talk about manufacturing and processing. That reflects the resource intensity of the Canadian economy and the fact that processing natural resources is a form of a manufacturing process, but it specifically involves raw resource inputs. So perhaps a better, shorter summary answer, Your Honor, is processing is a form of manufacturing.
Thank you.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about slide 90?
No, thank you.
All right, let's move on to slide 91. Please tell us about slide 91.
I want to think about the implications of Mr. Hutchings' measure of income tax revenue based on GDP of those processing sectors. So that estimate, therefore, is based on GDP in manufacturing industries. Those manufacturing industries include, right? So I showed you on the prior slide, Mr. Hutchings' slide, we saw the names of these aggregate sectors. I've then gone to Statistics Canada to look at the more precise industries that are included within those large categories, because the narrower industries within the category are more informative about what they're doing. So what industries are we including? We're including pulp and paper mills, stationery products, fine papers, cardboard container manufacturing. These are all the names of the industries Statistics Canada has assigned. Also, wood products manufacturing includes the manufacture of wood fencing, wooden kitchenware products, prefabricated homes, and things of that kind. Those are all in his GDP estimate. Now, the third sub-bullet on the first bullet of this slide, these are the industries that are included within the support activities for forestry, broad sector. These include essentially private contractors that work at firefighting, insect control, and reforestation. Now, I think those are activities related to primary resources, but I will point out that Mr. Hutchings, when he created his own Crown expense accounts for forestry before 1945, he excluded all of those things. When now he's creating his notional income tax account for forestry industries and seeking to include a portion of it in the NCR accounts, he thinks they should be included. That's an inconsistency to include it on the revenue side in this case, and to not include it on the expense side in the other case.
You're saying that this last line, firefighting, insect control, reforestation, are items of revenue?
Mr. Hutchings is suggesting here that the income tax revenues on the support activities for forestry sector are
okay,
relevant for determining NCRs. But the support activity for forestry sector mainly includes activities which he's already told us he thinks are not relevant for supporting Crown revenues from forestry. I think perhaps we should, if I may, stay on slide 92 for.
Oh, sorry, did you want to move on to slide 90? We're on slide 91.
Yes, let's.
You had more to say about slide 91?
Yes, I do, please.
Okay, so let's.
But mainly I'll simply repeat briefly the things I've said before. His income tax estimate is based on GDP in these sectors. GDP in these sectors is the return to workers and capital employed in manufacturing. and it excludes resource rents. GDP of those manufacturing sectors does not include resource rents from logging, because those are included in the GDP of the primary forestry and logging sector. I will also,
Could you explain that in a little more detail, please?
well, the statement that I just made about where the resource rents are in GDP, that's simply a function of the way in which the GDP accounts are created by the National Accounts team at Statistics Canada, based on the value of sales from their estimates of the value of sales from each establishment. An establishment is a place at which people work, right? It's not a company per se. In the case of an integrated company that is engaged in many parts of a production process, Statistics Canada would take data on the different portions of that company that they call establishments or places of work. For each of those, they make an estimate of the value of the outputs, the things that are sold by that establishment, and they subtract from that a measure of the value of inputs. And so by construction, therefore, the GDP accounts, the manufacturing sectors, the value of the logs would be a deduction in the GDP calculation. Right? So the value of the raw harvested timber from the point of view of the manufacturing sector, that's something you had to pay for in the GDP accounts. Therefore, it's deducted in the portion in the process of calculating GDP in the wood product sector. Now, in the logging sector, on the other hand, there is no deduction. The value of the logs is the value of the output of the sector. The only deductions would be for things like labor and capital and material costs used there, leaving the GDP of that sector as correctly measuring the resource rents from logging. So we look at GDP in the primary forestry sector for the purposes of determining economic rents, not these manufacturing sectors.
GDP of logging is that sector that you say is correctly measured by looking at resource rents.
GDP of the logging sector does provide a reasonable estimate of the resource rents from logging.
Thank you.
So if we return for a moment to slide 90, you've talked about where the resource rents are included properly in GDP. Can you just relate that to the chart here?
Mr. Hutchings' chart does show us the GDP from the forestry and logging primary sector. It's the dark blue region at the bottom of the chart. That to me would be a reasonable basis, although I have not investigated these data myself, but as I understand them, that would be a reasonable basis for estimating resource rents from forestry in Canada. Excuse me, I'm going to revise what I just said. I'm not sure whether this is based on Canada-wide data or Ontario data. We're dealing with Mr. Hutchings' data, and the title of the figure, he mentions Ontario. And I'm not sure at this moment precisely how he did that. I don't want to speak to that question, but I will revise the statement I just made to say the dark blue area is some estimate of resource rents from forestry.
The dark blue being the very bottom
That's right.
shaded part.
And the green shaded parts, did they reflect resource rents from forestry?
They reflect GDP in the downstream processing and manufacturing sectors. And that was a no.
Green area reflects GDP from the downstream activities. And you say it does, therefore does not reflect resource rents.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
So let's return to slide 91. tell us about the last full bullet on slide 91, please?
Last point I wish to make is that, in my opinion, Mr. Hutchings hasn't really provided a reliable estimate of those Crown income tax revenues from those broader forestry manufacturing sectors. Instead, what he's done is he's taken the GDP of those sectors and he's multiplied by 33% for all years, asserting that that's a reasonable measure of the tax rate that the Crown is applying to incomes in those sectors. I don't regard that as a reliable or the best practice way of estimating income tax revenues in these sectors. The next slide will show you what Mr. Hutchings said in support of his approach.
All right, let's go to slide 92.
This is a paragraph that is, what's displayed on slide 92 is a paragraph from Mr. Hutchings' reply report of October. And it explains why, on what basis he chose 33% of GDP as his preferred estimate of income tax revenues from the sector.
So you say Mr. Hutchings did not adopt what the best practice would be. What would be the best practice?
I don't see where the witness.
He
He just said-
testified to it earlier. Okay, can you check on the transcript?
I did say that I don't think that this 33% fixed across years, sourced from the OECD data that Mr. Hutchings has cited here, is best practice. I wish to clarify, however, I don't know that it's particularly wrong or that the correct answer, in my view, would be particularly higher or lower than this. I simply wish to note that the result here is very close to an assumption. Simply assume this rate of 33%. Based on the data described here, in my opinion, best practice would be to use more detailed data and data sourced from Canadian government institutions, such
Best
as
best practice to estimate income tax returns,
to
on the
estimate
sector.
income tax revenues.
revenues.
Here would be not to take GDP and multiply by a fixed percentage, as Mr. Hutchings has done. If I were to attempt to do so, I would probably rely on the so-called financial and taxation statistics, which are published through a joint process involving the Canada Revenue Agency and Statistics Canada on an annual basis for a series of many years. I would, seeking to do this, I would look at those data instead of what Mr. Hutchings did.
Let's move on to slide 93. Could you please tell us about slide 93?
Just a few more slides on these specific objections raised by Mr. Hutchings. It will get better in time. In his reply report and in his testimony, Mr. Hutchings called attention to a transcription error that caused us to include certain fish and game management expenses in our NCR accounts in certain years. We didn't intend to include those expenses. We made a mistake. We have now corrected that error. All of the values that I've been talking about so far and we'll talk about are fully reflective of that change that Mr. Hutchings pointed out to us. We thank him for pointing out the error and we apologize for the error. Once again, because the error pertains to expenses in relatively recent years, these are years for which we estimate NCRs are negative and that the Crown has experienced cumulative losses in NCRs. According to our model, there will be no payment of augmented annuities in those years. And therefore, this change, which we have done, had no impact on the computed value of augmented annuities under our approach.
Did Mr. Hutchings accept any of the errors you pointed out in his accounts?
I'm not sure of the answer to that question.
Let's move on to slide 94.
Another point raised by Mr. Hutchings in his reply report and in his testimony, Mr. Hutchings claimed that we double counted certain capital expenses. That is not true. Mr. Hutchings' statements flowed from a misunderstanding of how our accounts work, which admittedly were complicated in this regard. We noted in our SIR reply, however, that the amount that we counted once that's at issue here included some capital expenses for recreation programs that we wish to exclude. And the original report that we submitted, we included all of that program, which itself included some recreation programs. We went back to the PAO, we got further data to disaggregate that program, and we removed the recreation component of that item up to the year 1991. After 1991, that further detail is no longer available, so we were not able to disaggregate it thereafter. But we did the best that was possible with the PAO data, and we did revise our values of expenses on the basis I've just described. The values that I'm reporting in my testimony are fully reflective of that change up to 1991.
You say you obtained additional data. What was this additional data?
The PAO every year includes many, many, many numbers, and we enter those numbers that are relevant to computing NCRs. In this case, when we did the data entry, we failed to notice that subaggregates would be more useful, that the amount that we entered was for a program that included recreation expense. The PAO had further detail. Original data set didn't have that detail. We've since added that detail.
So it was to the detail being added or counted was with respect to capital programs for recreation, capital expenses for recreation programs.
I believe the next slide has more detail, and Your Honor might want to look at it as we discuss. Does it?
No, the next slide is about a different subject.
So this program, then I have to rely on my memory, but this program was called Recreation and Resource Management Programs, capital expense for recreation and resource management.
Thank you.
And just to reflect everyone's visual memory, if you could please put up Hutchings demonstrative slide 245. The next one, please, the next page. Just so that we remember this is a few months ago. This is the chart that Professor Smart was just talking about.
Thank you.
I found the verbal description a little hard to recall it in that way myself, but I feel like the chart, I remember it better. I hope that helps the court. Let's move on to slide 95. Could you please tell us about slide 95?
In his reply report and his testimony, Mr. Hutchings also objected to how we accounted for overhead administrative costs of the Colonization Roads branch.
Oh, sorry, we're having a tech. Oh, sorry, please continue.
So what's the story here?
Good question.
Colonization roads are included in our accounts, but not in Mr. Hutchings' accounts. We think some portion of the initial capital expenditures on roads was important to resource development. So we included Colonization Roads branch, which was the government entity responsible for building those roads. Initially, it was a branch of the Department of the prior period, it was a branch of the Department of Lands and Forests. In 1926, it was established as a separate department of the government of Ontario. But it's still reported to the same minister. It's reasonable to believe that it would have shared administrative functions of the DLF, and that we had to adjust our approach to estimating overhead expense to reflect that use by a separate department of DLF's administrative functions. The result of our approach was therefore to include a higher percentage of overhead in those years than a strict reading of our overhead approach would suggest. We attempted to adapt to that change in accounting for the colonization roads branch. And Mr. Hutchings thinks that the percentage we included is too high. So he raised this criticism. He didn't propose a specific alternative approach that he believes we should have used instead, which is natural given that in his own accounts, he ignores these expenses entirely. So we couldn't go to his documents and figure out how he thought,
Ignores or rejects them as relevant expenses.
excuse me, he doesn't include them in his accounts. He does discuss them at certain points in his report. So we didn't know precisely what he wanted us to do, but our best guess about the alternative approach that was suggested by his critique indicates to me that if we were to change our approach in the way he suggested, then expenses included in our accounts would go down. Therefore, our NCRs would go up, because this is an earlier period in which we believe the Crown had positive NCRs, and we believe that the augmentation promise would therefore have triggered higher augmented annuities in those years. In this case, and this is the first case which this is true, in this case, if we had changed what we did, it would increase NCRs and increase augmented annuities. So I went back and, based on my best estimate of what he's suggesting we should have done, calculated the impact on the annuities to be paid for RST under our model. Then I added interest to convert it to present value. And I believe that what's at issue here is $2.8 million out of the $999 million that we estimate would be paid under the most expansive model of sharing.
That $2.8 million, is that at present value?
Yes.
Thank you.
And at whose interest rates?
Bodway and Smart interest.
Mr. Hutchings said that in some years you included more than 100% of ministry expenses. Is that true?
That is true in some years. Our overhead approach results in an estimate incorporating the impact on the colonization roads department that exceeds 100% of DLF expenses. In other years, it's less than 100%.
Why is it appropriate to count more than 100%?
I believe it's appropriate because on average, because the over 100% and under 100% are offsetting, and it was the result that was delivered by the method that we determined before we looked at the data. I believe it's appropriate, but it may not be accurate.
And this over 100% is just on overhead? Did you ask Mr. Lipton? Overhead expenses or all expenses relating to colonization roads?
The result of our approach to estimating overhead for the colonization roads department that was shared with DLF resulted in us including more than 100% of the total DLF expenses for certain years.
Thank you.
And the amount of this inclusion you've calculated, and it is
The alternative approach, which I believe is the best representation of what Mr. Hutchings would have done here, the included percentage is never more than 100%. The total impact on the value of annuities, including interest, of making that change is $2.8 million.
Are the general expenses attributable to the colonization roads higher than $2.8 million? At present value?
Excuse me, could you repeat the question?
Sure. Are the other expenses related to colonization roads higher than $2.8 million at your present value?
Yes.
Are they substantially higher?
If your question is the total of all colonization road expenses of the government of Ontario higher than $2.8 million in present value, the answer to that is yes, dramatically higher.
All right, let's move on to slide 96. Please tell us about this slide.
Well, now we're going to talk about transportation expenditures. And I'll start by noting Mr. Hutchings didn't include, I'll note again, that Mr. Hutchings did not include any Crown expenditures on railways or on these long distance roads through the territory in his NCR accounts up to 1945.
Sorry, before you go on, you used the term long distance roads. Is this what's often referred to as colonization roads?
Yes, the language in the public accounts and government documents of that period is colonization roads. And of course, that includes the name of the branch and department we just spoke about. That term to describe the roads in question dates back to early in the 19th century. But it should be understood that in referring to colonization roads in those documents in that period in this way, we're talking about long distance roads. We're talking about intercity highways in particular in the period in question, the 1920s and 30s.
Were colonization roads used to encourage settlement?
There was certainly a link between building colonization roads in the 19th century and settlement. Various links, and I can expand if you wish. Without the roads, there would not have been development of the territories, including settlement by settlers. Moreover, there were links between the laying out of these colonization road allowances and the Crown's policy on free grants of land. Building the road or laying out the road, they weren't always built when they were surveyed, was associated with settlers having an option to claim certain land along those road allowances for free. So there was a link between long distance roads and colonization policy, the objective of encouraging settlement in the territory, particularly in the 19th century. By the 1920s and 30s, where the bulk of the expenditure that I'm talking about occurred, I don't think those links were particularly important. It was just a name given for long distance roads.
I know we're going to get to this later, but were colonization roads used for things other than settlement?
Yes, in our opinion, they were used for a variety of purposes, including the extraction, and including to support the extraction of resources and getting those resources to markets.
Go ahead.
Sorry, so I did actually cut you off in the middle of the first bullet on this page, so please continue.
Right, well, these expenses were large. I'm going to use expense and expenditure equivalently here, even though sometimes in accounting, we make a distinction between them, but that needn't slow us down. So these expenses were large in the territory. In our opinion, they were essential for resource development in the territory. And in the second bullet, I describe an economic model of why rail and road investments were essential in supporting resource rents. The idea is the Crown investing in those assets, those transportation infrastructure assets, it reduced transport costs for resource companies, resource extractors. Because their transport costs were lower with the Crown investments, their resource rents per unit of work on extraction activities were higher. And so rents have already increased through lower transport costs. But then there are going to be follow-on effects. The lower transport costs, the higher profitability of resource investments that flowed from it would spur further development. There are now more companies involved, more workers involved, more extraction is taking place. And so rents increase yet again. So through those direct effects and those immediate follow-on effects, investments in transport result in higher rents, which in turn support a higher Crown revenues from resources. That's how we see it.
Can you speak to the third bullet on main bullet on slide 96, please?
So we want to capture some notion of the Crown's support for rents through transportation investments. This is what we did in a nutshell. We counted Crown subsidies to regional railways in RSD only up to the year 1917. That is, to clarify, we counted only subsidies that were enacted up to the year 1917. And the second thing that we count is spending on colonization roads, and another term that was used in the public accounts was northern roads. We believe it describes the same thing, intercity roads in Northern Ontario. We count spending on those programs up to the year 1937.
You've mentioned regional railways. What do you mean by a regional railway?
I mean that we're going to exclude the transcontinental railways. So the Crown in Canada between 1885 and roughly 1920 invested massively in railway development. The most notable case is the CPR, which economists have estimated Crown subsidies amounted to $200 billion in present day terms. 200 billion. We exclude those transcontinental railways. We include shorter railways through the territory, which will be depicted on a subsequent slide.
You say that you stopped counting the subsidies to these regional railways in 1917. Why do you stop in 1917?
For a variety of reasons. The most important is that we think that the most important Crown investment to consider here is the initial capital expenditure to build out the line. Without the Crown investing in that initial development, the development wouldn't have happened, in our opinion. We count only those initial capital expenditures. We don't try to capture subsequent subsidies to entities like Canadian National Railway, which was a wholly owned Crown corporation for many years in later years. We don't try to capture any further subsidies that might reflect subsidies to operating costs of those railways in later years. We're only interested in that initial capital investment, which supported resource development.
You say you count spending on colonization in northern roads up to 1937. Why up to 1937?
There's a similar concern here. We want to capture the subsidy or the expenditure on the initial capital build out. We don't want to capture ongoing depreciation and maintenance costs. We also think that in the case of roads, initially the Crown had no other revenue sources that could be earmarked for paying for roads. The first gasoline tax was introduced in Ontario, I believe it's 1925, but at a very low rate. It was increased to 8 cents per gallon nominal in 1936. At that point, we think it's reasonable to think that the ongoing expenses on long distance roads were offset against gasoline tax revenues of the Crown. And so we stopped counting at that point.
Let's turn to slide 97. What does this map show?
This is an historical map showing railway lines through the RST territory in 1913, or 1910 perhaps, somewhere in that range. And it's meant to give people a sense of the importance of railways to the territory at that time and the component of those railways that are included in our accounts. So the railways here, so the evidently RST is shaded in gray. Railways are darker black lines through the territory. The lower right corner, we see the Algoma Central railway line. And it's indicated in red on the map. Going east-west along the north shore of Lake Superior in the south of the territory, we see the Canadian Pacific Railway, which is excluded from our accounts. The north of that is the Canadian Northern Ontario Railway, which we do include a portion to RST territory. And north of that again is the railway that was then known as the National Transcontinental Railway. Again, it was a transcontinental and we don't include it. We do also include regional railways around Port Arthur, now Thunder Bay, including the Port Arthur and Duluth, and a small component of the track of the Grand Trunk Pacific from Port Arthur up to the Height of Land. So those are railways we include. The map should give you the sense of just how extensive Canada's investments in transportation infrastructure were at that time to build these 3 railways across the territory to the north of Superior. Certainly a remarkable achievement, and it was, in our opinion, essential to the development of the region.
I think now might be a good time for a morning break.
Thank you.
Another thing you may be seated.
Let's move on to slide 98. Please tell us about slide 98.
We're talking about the importance of transportation infrastructure for resource rents. I find this a interesting subject. The role of railways in particular in resource development in Canada and the incredible importance of the Crown in building out these railways in the period that we're discussing. In our report, we go on at length about this issue. I won't do that today, but I'll just offer 2 particular points to quotations from the report that I think are indicative of that importance. First is a quotation from a distinguished economic historian in Canada from the period, A.R.M. Lower, who wrote in his 1938 book on the history of forestry in Canada, quote, "Without the canal and the railroad, many of the pine trees of Ontario would still be standing in their native glory. Without the railways, no logging." Lower is a big deal for economists. I think it's also important that he lived through the golden age of forestry in Ontario, and he had direct familiarity with what we're talking about. The importance of railways to resources, I think, was understood by the Crown as well. Government documents of the era frequently reference railways and their role in resource development, to a lesser extent roads as well. One quotation of that kind comes from the Commissioner of Crown Lands in the annual report of the department in 1879. Commissioner said at the time, quote, "The penetration of railways into the remote parts of the country will mark a revolutionary era in the timber trade." Turned out he was right. In my opinion, the Crown understood the railways were important to resource development, and that helped to spur the Crown to pay subsidies to the railways. They valued the resource development and they valued the revenues they would get from it. The railways themselves were intimately connected with the resource industries, the extraction industries. They facilitated resource development in the ways we've been talking about. They also profited from resource development themselves. Some examples of that for the RST, the Pigeon River Lumber Company at Port Arthur ran the largest sawmill in the territory at the turn of the 20th century. It was the largest employer in the city at that time. They invested directly in railways because that was the only way, the best way, and indeed the only way to transport logs to their mill at Port Arthur. Another key example in the RST is the financier Francis Clergue, C-L-E-R-G-U-E, who not only built the Algoma Central Railway, but invested in mines and logging along that route. Indeed, the Algoma Central was conceived as a way of getting ore from the Helen mine on the North Shore at Michipicoten to the steel mill that he was building at Sault Ste. Marie. He did the same, that is Clergue's enterprise called Consolidated, Lake Superior, I believe, did the same for logging. They built a major pulp and paper mill at Sault Ste. Marie, which today we know as St. Mary's Pulp and Paper. And he brought the logs to it on the Algoma Central, which he also built. Again, I say he, many people were involved in building it. Clergue's involvement ended fairly early on. I've been talking about railways. Similar arguments apply to the long distance roads. They connected logging camps and mine properties to markets. And the markets were the places where they sourced their inputs for their extraction activities and where they sold their outputs. Of course, it also served as a way of getting labor to the extraction points as well.
Are these what have also been called the colonization roads?
Yes,
Did these roads decrease the transportation cost for resource producers?
the roads also decreased transportation costs. Without the roads, transportation would have been very expensive, indeed prohibitive in many cases.
I have to apologize. We're about to get into a couple of long and very complicated slides. Let's go to slide 99.
Well, I thought it'd be nice to include a couple of pictures. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. In a case where many thousands of words have been written, let's just look at two examples of the relationship between resource processing and railways. This is a picture of the Pigeon River sawmill at Port Arthur in the year 1903. It's a little murky, as an old picture will be, but I think you can clearly see railway cars on a railway spur in the foreground of the picture, and behind it, one of the mill buildings. So as I said, Pigeon River would bring logs on that railway, offload them, process them, cut them into boards, among other things, and then send them out again on the railway.
Let's go to slide 100.
This is a picture of the iron sintering plant at Wawa in 1998. That was an ore upgrading facility that was built to handle ore extracted from the Helen mine when it reopened. Again, here you can see a very long line, what I imagine are ore cars, kind of boxes along the railway. I think they would have contained ore. The railway went from the Helen mine to this upgrading plant in Wawa, and then again from Wawa to Algoma Steel at Sault Ste. Marie. In the foreground of the picture, you can see 4 locomotives in the livery of Algoma Central.
Slide 101. Please tell us about slide 101.
So because transport networks supported resources, we want to include a portion of the Crown's expenses on them in our accounts. but transport networks benefited other users in addition to resource producers. Recalling my testimony about our conceptual approach, this is a case in which we think those other uses needs to be taken into account. In particular, when I think about a but-for world in which the only use of the railways was resource development, it is difficult to imagine the Crown would have spent so much as they did on railways at that time. Absent these other uses, I think the expenses would have been lower. Therefore, I believe that it would not be appropriate to include all of the railway subsidies or the road subsidies in our NCR accounts as a subsidy to resource rents. So instead, we apportion them. We estimated the share of railway revenues at that time, particularly using data from the year 1919. We estimated the share of railway revenues or earnings that came from the transportation of the key resource products. Key resource products being wood and mines products. This table shows you the data that we use in order to make that estimate. And I've highlighted with a little red circle, oval, I've highlighted the bottom line from that, which is that for the railways in Northern Ontario, at that time, 26.9% of their earnings came from transporting those wood products and mine products. Now, in doing that, we're excluding all the other ways in which the resource companies would have benefited from the railways. We're not counting the transportation of the workers, for example. We don't include any passenger traffic or anything of that kind. We don't include transportation of other goods that would have been useful to those workers, such as food products in remote communities and things of that kind. So our process is to take the total Crown spending on the railways, then multiply by the 26.9% of it that we think is attributable to resource product usage of the railway. Then for our resource related subsidy amounts that we get from that, we apportion them geographically to the RST based on railway trackage. So of course, all of these railways included some track miles, back then they dealt in miles, included some track miles in RST and some track miles out of RST. We read the legislation that enacted the subsidies, figured out what trackage subsidy applied to, and then we apportioned the subsidies to RST based on railway trackage.
So the 26.9 represents your consideration that the roads and rail moved things other than logs and minerals,
Yes,
whether they were related to resource activity or not. If I understand it, your 26.9% represents only the movement of resources in and out,
resource products, yes.
resource product. Thank you.
Yes. So it excludes freight that was not resource products, and it excludes all passenger traffic as well.
But you don't, it's 26% of all the expenses of the rail, of all the subsidies, even if they're subsidies to passenger movement.
The only, Your Honor, I can answer that as a no, in the sense that the only subsidies we include were the initial capital subsidies for building the road,
Oh,
the line.
And the
There were
same for
no
railway?
operating subsidies.
And the same for railways?
Yes,
Right,
Yes.
okay.
only the initial capital construction of the road and rail lines.
Thank you.
So after you calculated that 26.9%, what did you do then?
So we then apportioned that portion of the subsidy, the 26.9% portion of the subsidy, geographically to the RST in the way I described a minute ago, based on track miles in RST versus other subsidized track miles outside of RST. On this slide, I've given an example of how we do it for the federal subsidies for the Canadian Northern Ontario Railway, which is partially in RST. I'm sorry to report that the number on this slide is incorrect. The correct portion of federal subsidies for Canadian Northern Ontario for track built in RST, I now believe to be 29%. And the slide should have read 29% in the third bullet.
Instead of 46?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you.
And I would, if I may, I will clarify that the error here, for which I apologize, is an error in what I put on the slide, not what is currently in our NCR accounts.
Thank you.
So that's how we proceed then. We count the subsidies from public accounts documents. We multiply by 26.9% to get the railway, the resource portion. Then we multiply by the geographic shares for each one of the railways.
So to take the example of the Canadian Northern Ontario Railway, the amount that you would include in the RST as a railway expense would be 26.9%. You would include 29% of that 26.9% as an expense.
Yes.
And would you like to speak to the last bullet on this page?
Well, just by way of summary, I'm suggesting that the resulting expenses in our NCR accounts are a reasonable estimate of the Crown's contribution to resource rents in the RST through their transport investments.
So this calculation that you show on the slide, these numbers you show on the slide seems to be about railway. What did you do for roads?
We proceed in the same way. We measure the overall expenditures of the Crown from the public accounts document. The documents, in this case, only Ontario's public accounts documents. Then we wish to apportion those expenses also to resource versus non-resource uses, but we don't have any data similar to the data shown on this slide for road usage at that time. And so in the absence of any other data, based on what I've read about the way in which roads and railways were used in Northern Ontario at that time, I concluded it was not unreasonable to take the same 26.9% share of the road spending and attribute that to the contribution of road spending to resource uses and resource rents. But I don't have any data for that. Then the next step is again geographic apportionment. And we geographically apportion the road spending based on information in the annual reports of the government departments on where they were building roads in each year.
And am I looking at a slide for this idea?
There is a bullet on some slide that says we do the same for roads as we do for railways, Your Honor, but I don't see it right now.
And it's also
Well, I think it's the second bullet on slide 101, where you say we use 26.9 for road and rail spending.
Thank you.
But when I listened to you, you were talking about rail the whole time.
Yes.
And then you said we just, for some reason, decided to use that portion to or that percentage to apportion road spending on roads.
I gave a specific reason, which I can repeat if you wish.
Okay, go ahead.
That we don't have any specific data for roads. And based on my reading of the various documents, I concluded that roads in Northern Ontario at that time were used in a similar way to railways. So absent other data, it was reasonable to impute the road share based on the rail share.
Thank you.
Just for the court's reference, in what we call the nominal values report. So that's exhibit 60 entitled Net Crown Resource-Based Revenues in the Robinson Huron and Robinson Superior Treaty Territories. If you look at section Roman IX, section 9, it discusses transportation spending in general. And if you look at section Roman IX 9.3, there's a specific discussion of the colonization roads.
Thank you.
So let's move on to slide 102. There's a lot of numbers on this slide. Can you please tell us about them?
Yes, so I want to give the court a sense of what we do in our NCR accounts based on what I've just explained about our approach to transportation. And so I think the best way to do that is just show you the numbers that we include as expenses in support of NCRs referable to roads and railways. These are those numbers for each decade that we include. And we break it down into the road spending in the first column, and the railway aid subsidies then were called railway aid. We do it for both the Ontario Crown and the federal Crown. Federal government spent a lot of money on railways, including for these regional railways in Northern Ontario. So I've separated out those two components. The final column just adds up those amounts.
So the fourth column from the left is entitled Railway Aid. Is that Ontario spending?
Yes.
Are the amounts on this table on slide 102 nominal dollars?
Yes, in this case, I've included nominal dollars because we're not trying to compare across different years, right? So within a particular decade, the value of a nominal dollar is roughly the same for all years. Just to be as transparent as possible about what we're including. In this case, I thought it was better to not convert to present value dollars since we're not comparing across years. These are the actual numbers that go into our accounts and they get converted to present value.
This table, are the amounts in the table RST amounts?
Yes, so another potential ambiguity in dealing with the Hutchings and Bodway Smart reports is, are those amounts province-wide or RST? In this case, these are RST specific numbers.
Why are the expenses so high in the decade 1910 to 1919?
Well, this was the second great railway boom in Canada. So we built 2 transcontinental lines in the early 1910s before World War I, and invested in many other regional railways as well. In our specific accounts here, the biggest component for that decade is the federal aid, which here amounts to $1 million. Much of that went to the Canadian Northern Ontario Railway.
Why is there nothing in this table after 1949?
Well, we stopped counting after these initial capital investments for road and rail. Indeed, we stopped counting rail in 1917, but we still have some dollars after 1917. And the reason for that is that when Ontario gave aid to railways, they gave it in the form of what they called railway certificates, which was a form of scrip or bond that the railway company could then take and use as credit in various transactions. And those bonds were gradually retired by Ontario up to the year 1944 or 49. And in Ontario's own accounts, they tell us the amount of those bonds when they retired them. So that's how we've included in our accounts. Because everything is converted to present value, whether we count the full amount in the year the subsidy was enacted, or we count it gradually over time as the bonds are retired, makes no difference to the ultimate bottom line.
Let's go on to slide 103. Please tell us about slide 103.
Well, we've reached the end of what I wish to say about our nominal calculations and the difference between them and Mr. Hutchings' calculations. And I thank everyone for your patience. It has been a long haul. And so by way of conclusion, I want to show you the end result of those calculations. So once again, we're dealing with nominal dollars by decade. In this case, the net Crown resource revenues that we estimate for the RST. And it's decomposed into the various types of resources in our accounts: mining, forestry, and land. In addition, although I haven't spoken about it because we rely on Mr. Hutchings and Mr. Hamill, we include the hydroelectric net Crown revenues in our NCR accounts. And then the next column shows NCRs referable to transport. Of course, those numbers are all negative, so entered here in parentheses, because these are additional expenses that offset the revenues in the other accounts. Final column is the summation of all of those components. You can see, again, these are in nominal dollars, but we start with positive nominal dollars in the earliest years. There are then negatives in the early 20th century, reflecting the decline of Ontario's resource economy in the interwar period and these investments in transport. Then there's the second forestry boom in RST, causes NCRs in nominal terms to go positive. They're reported here in nominal terms. They go positive again around the end of the Great Depression through World War II and the immediate post-war era. And then, as we've discussed, we estimate that NCRs start to turn negative in RST beginning in the 1960s, and they remain in the aggregate negative for all decades thereafter.
Are there no revenues from transport?
There are no revenues from transport.
Did transport support other revenues?
There are no specific taxes on the railways that I'm aware of that we would wish to include here as offsetting the railway subsidies. Of course, it is true, as we were discussing before the break, in response to what Mr. Hutchings said, one can trace a variety of economic links between particular investments of the Crown and economic activities in the country. In this case, we could apply the same kind of logic. We could say that investing in railways led to more workers being employed by the industries that needed those railways.
I was thinking of direct revenues.
Yes.
So to ship logs.
Yes.
Did clients not pay to ship logs and ore?
Yes, they did, but they didn't pay the Crown. And we're not including any subsidies from the Crown that would be referable to those operating costs associated with shipping those logs.
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, you were describing some of the patterns in the table. Please keep going.
I think I've said everything I wish to.
Okay. Just one last thing. I see that there's no overall total of where you sum everything up on this page.
Yes, that's not an omission. These are nominal NCRs by decade, and it would not be economically meaningful to take a sum of them, in our opinion. First, you have to convert them to 2020 dollars, present values, and then you sum them. And of course, we do that, and I'll discuss that in the last part of my testimony.
So this concludes my portion of the direct examination, and I will pass the witness to my colleague, Mr. Marcello.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Smart.
Afternoon. Good afternoon.
It is afternoon. So as you signaled, you're going to move now in your testimony away from nominal values most immediately into present values. And from there, most immediately again into your annuities model.
Yes.
So let's begin with slide 105 and talk us through what you want to say about present values arising from this slide, please.
So as Mr. Marcello just said, so far we've been talking about nominal, our calculations of nominal amounts. When necessary, in order to give meaning to those amounts, I converted them to present value, but we haven't talked about how that conversion should be done or how we do it. And that's the subject of present value. Present value is defined as the nominal amount, any particular nominal amount in any year, plus compound interest on that nominal amount from the relevant year in which that amount accrued up to the year 2020. So as I suggested, I think on day one, you could think of the nominal amount as a principal amount. When you think about principal and interest on loans, you can think of the nominal amount as the principal, and present value adds interest up to the year 2020 on that principal amount. Why do we do that in this case? The sub-bullet of the second bullet gives our answer. Present value compensates for the time value of money. Time value of money, term that we commonly use to describe the lost opportunity to spend those funds in the past or to invest them. So how do you measure the time value of money? In our opinion, it's measured by the interest rate on Government of Canada long-term bonds. And let me explain why that's the right interest rate to use here. You can think about it from the Crown perspective or from the annuitant's perspective, right? So we're trying to compensate for the time value of money on augmented annuities that we believe should have been paid in the past, according to our interpretation of the augmentation promise, but were not paid. If those augmented annuities had been paid, then absent any other changes in the Crown's financial policies, the Crown would have had to issue more bonds at that time in order to balance its budget. So if they paid the annuities, they would have had to issue those bonds, and they would have had to pay interest on those bonds from that date up to 2020. And so the interest rate on Government of Canada long-term bonds correctly measures the time value of those funds from the Government of Canada, from the government perspective. Now, on the other hand, we want to think about it from the perspective of the annuitants who did not receive those hypothetical augmented annuities in the past. If they had received those funds in the past, then they could have purchased government bonds and they could have accumulated interest on those augmented annuities at the Government of Canada bond rate. And that would exist for them as additional wealth today. They didn't receive those funds. They didn't have the opportunity to make those investments. And so we include in the value from the annuitant perspective also compound interest at the government bond rate.
Thank you. Now, I do want you to go through these slides and articulate whatever points you wish to make completely as you wish to make them. But as we move to the next slide, I note you make a comment right at the beginning about standard economic principles and risk-free rates of return. So if we could maybe begin with that point and then carry on.
Sure. Yes, please. This is really important. So everything I've said so far is based on this notion of issuing or purchasing government bonds. But then we now want to address the question of, well, what bonds and what interest rate would be appropriate in doing these calculations? And in our view, drawing on standard economic principles, we believe that this time value of money, or equivalently time cost of money, is measured by the risk-free rate of return. The risk-free rate of return means the return on a risk-free asset, an asset that we can purchase and not experience any risk. The best example, I think all economists agree, the best example of a risk-free asset is a government bond that has no risk of default, where investors perceive that that government will not default on that promise to pay. The Government of Canada is one such government, which has never defaulted on its debt, in which markets believe will not default in the future. When we think about Canadian interest rates, we think about the Government of Canada bond rates as the best indicator of the risk-free rate of return.
Carry on, please.
I might add that Mr. Hutchings takes the same approach here. He talks about the risk-free rate of return, and he also measures the risk-free rate of return by government bond rates, although with some differences I'm going to discuss.
You next make a point about some things that don't matter, in your opinion.
All the things to talk about. I'm going to now talk about things that don't matter. But it might matter in this case. In our view, it doesn't matter if those individuals who would have received the funds in the past would have saved those funds, purchasing government bonds or other assets, or consumed those funds, they devoted those funds to their own consumption at that time. It doesn't matter whether they would have saved or consumed. In both cases of savings or consumption in the past, the risk-free rate of return correctly measures the opportunity cost of those funds at that time. They would have put it to the best use possible from their own perspective, whether that was consumption or saving. And the opportunity cost is best measured by the return on the savings vehicle, which is the interest rate.
I'm just going to repeat this back to you. The risk-free rate of return correctly measures the opportunity cost. So had the annuitant, so you work on an assumption that the annuitant would have made the best use of the money at the time, and that is the equivalent to the risk to the long-term bond rate.
Yes, we take the standard economic approach, which is that people know what's best for themselves. They would have made the best decision from their own perspective in the past. But that, Your Honor, is not the same as assuming that people would have saved the funds. They would have either saved or consumed as they chose. But in both cases, the best measure of the value of those funds in that best use is the interest rate on the bond.
So I don't know that you've tied, I don't know that I need this, but I don't know that you have tied the best measure of value, the word value, to consumption.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if you need to for going forward. I just noticed that.
Well, I don't know if I need to either, Your Honor. It depends on what other issues may be in your own mind, if I can put it that way.
Okay.
I'm trying to explain why we don't think about the savings or investment choice of the annuitants, the Anishinaabe, here in deciding what the right rate of return is for our calculations. But if one were to accept that that's right, that this decision to save or consume is irrelevant here, I'm happy to move on.
Thank you. Go ahead.
So the third bullet on this slide deals with another issue that doesn't matter. And this one is central to the differences between Mr. Hutchings and ourselves. In our opinion, it doesn't matter whether, in addition to government long-term bonds, there exist other assets that earn higher average rates of return over time. And there do exist other such assets, such as, for example, stocks or equity investments. Historically, stocks have earned higher average rates of return than government bonds. A prudent long-term investor holds part of their portfolio in government bonds, safe bonds, and another part of their portfolio in other riskier assets like stocks that earn higher average returns. The higher average return on those other assets like stocks is the benefit that they get by holding those assets, but it comes with a cost. The cost is the greater risk in the returns to those other assets. In addition to the greater risk of those other assets, there are typically greater transactions costs. It's easy and cheap to buy a government bond or to hold a certificate of deposit at a bank. It's more costly to invest in stocks and invest in the information that would be necessary to invest wisely in stocks. Now, as I said, just one sub-bullet ago, I said prudent investors hold both safe bonds and risky stocks. Because they hold them both, it's reasonable to conclude that they regard the higher return on their risky investments like stocks as being fully offset by these greater costs, such as greater risk exposure and greater transactions costs. If those prudent investors regarded the stock investments or other risky investments with higher returns as being better than the bonds, accounting for those costs I've been talking about, then they wouldn't hold the bonds. They'd hold 100% of their portfolio in those risky stocks. So the fact that prudent investors do in practice and are advised by experts to hold a mix of bonds and stocks indicates that those higher average returns on the stocks are roughly offset by the higher costs of those investment strategies.
Thank you.
That the higher average returns on, let's say, equities are roughly offset by. What does that mean?
In choosing to hold the stock,
They're worth the costs that they have invested.
in choosing to hold the stock instead of the bond,
Yeah.
I may expect a higher average return in future on that stock, but I also recognize that that will come with additional costs. Those costs are the risk to which I'm exposing myself in that investment and the amounts that I have to pay in order to get into that market. And I believe it's reasonable to think that those two sides of the balance sheet balance out. The extra returns roughly balance against those extra costs I've just described.
In other words, there are no there are no better returns because they're spending them all on the costs.
Yes.
Well,
Well,
that's not what the world thinks, is it?
well, if we include in that, when Your Honor says spending on, if we can include the costs that I experience in expectation, because I don't know whether this investment will be successful or not. So it's not an actual outlay out of my pocket in that case, but it's a cost that I experience at a psychic level.
You're saying the peace of mind cost,
Yes.
as they say at the car rental. But,
Don't listen to them.
but I think what you're suggesting is no prudent investor would invest in the equity market.
No, Your Honor, I'm not suggesting that. They do, and experts advise them to do so.
Right.
But what I'm saying is that they do continue to hold safe bonds in their portfolio.
Right.
And if they thought that if investors believed that they would earn such higher average returns, expected returns, equivalent language, from the stock investment, and those higher average returns more than offset these additional costs we've discussed, then, if you're in for $1, why aren't you in for all your dollars in those terms? The fact that the bonds are still in the portfolio indicates that roughly there would be no additional benefit to holding more stocks and less bonds in that portfolio. It's based on the standard economic principle that what people do is what's best for them. And so it's informative about what their preferences are.
So by investing in the stock market, whether 50-50, 70-30, 60-40, you say this leads inevitably to the conclusion that there is no better return, whether it's through peace of mind or dollars in the bank, there's no better return than a long-term bond. Is that the conclusion?
I'm
You
not-
say the fact.
I'm not drawing
The
that
bonds are
conclusion
still
in
there.
that way. I would prefer to turn around, Your Honor, Honor's description of what I'm saying. I'm saying by investing in bonds, investors are indicating they regard bond returns as not too bad relative to stock returns.
Okay,
If they
Fair
thought that the return on bonds was bad relative to what they could get from stocks, including those additional costs, then they would not be holding those bonds. But they do
Okay.
hold bonds.
okay.
Now, Professor, you've said several times, or you pointed out several times in your testimony, the importance of the time value of money and the model one uses to bring old money forward to present day. And you begin to illustrate the implications of some of those choices on your next slide, if I understand you correctly. Could you then take us through that? 107.
Yes, thank you. So the issue that we've just been talking about, bond returns as a measure of the risk-free rate of return versus stock returns, which include a risk premium as a compensation for those additional risks. This is a point of contention between Bodway and Smart, and on the one hand, and Hutchings and Stiglitz on the other hand. Professor Bodway will spend more time talking about this very important issue in his own testimony, which will follow mine. And so I'm going to just move on, but I want to note the implications of the higher rates of return assumed by Mr. Hutchings for the kind of calculations that is my primary role here and that I'm primarily here to talk about. And in order to do that, let's first just illustrate what his interest rates imply for the conversion of nominal amounts into present value amounts. So Mr. Hutchings' interest rates are based in part on his assumptions about what returns on stock investments would have been in the past. And they come down to this. They imply that when he goes to converting $1,000 nominal in a given year into present value dollars in the year 2020, he proceeds as follows. If that $1,000 accrued in 1850, he converts the 1,000 nominal into $139,051,000 in 2020. If it accrues in 1870, same idea, but not so many years of compound interest. And therefore, 1,000 nominal in 1870 is, according to Mr. Hutchings, worth $40,532,000 today. In 1890, Mr. Hutchings converts 1,000 nominal dollars into $13,523,000 present value dollars. In my opinion, these are very high rates of interest. I've written they're extraordinarily high. So there's a broader discussion of the principles under which Mr. Hutchings does his conversion versus ours, which I intend to leave to Professor Bodway to the extent possible. But I want to point out that these high rates of interest and these very high present value conversion factors imply that Mr. Hutchings' present value results are highly sensitive to errors and inaccuracies in his nominal accounts in those early years. So to the extent that there were, inevitably there are inaccuracies in his accounts and mine, the extent that there are such inaccuracies in the early years, they're going to be multiplied by big numbers. And in my opinion, it makes his present value numbers for the early years less reliable.
I think I was following it and then I lost it. Because these multipliers are so large, it makes errors or inaccuracies, particularly in the early years, or just that the rates or the bottom line is sensitive to reliability of nominal values in early years.
Yes,
But then I thought you concluded by saying it makes his early years numbers less reliable.
well, it simply means that if, for example, he made an error, by error, I mean just something was inaccurate in his accounts. If he made an error of that kind that amounted to $1,000 nominal dollars in his accounts in 1870, none of us would be surprised if that happened. That could happen to him or to me, be off by $1,000 in nominal terms in a given year. If that given year was 1870, that would translate into 40 million plus dollars of present value in the year 2020. So still his best estimate of the nominal amount in 1870 would be converted to his best estimate of the present value amount at his preferred rates. But we now must recognize that the range of reasonable possible conclusions based on his estimates is now just much wider because he multiplied the nominal amounts by a big number. That's all I wish to say is that confidence intervals, as economists define them, get larger because of these, are larger in the presence of these very high conversion factors for those early years. It's not a matter of whether he's right or wrong, but how much confidence we can have in his estimates as a
And
result of the conversion factors.
to make sure I understand, if I say it this way, a more liberal bring forward model as opposed to a different one might magnify the impact of those errors in early years. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true. And I'd like to add that the errors could be positive or negative, could increase or decrease his nominal amounts, no particular bias that I'm imagining in his accounts here. But whether it's positive or negative, the bigger his present value conversion factor, the bigger the corresponding inaccuracy in present value terms. And so the wider the range of plausible conclusions that one could draw from his accounts.
And here again, you've used the word, the bigger the corresponding inaccuracy. That's based on a presumption there is an original inaccuracy.
Yes,
Okay. It doesn't, just because there's a big multiplier, it doesn't make it inaccurate. It just makes I think what you're saying, or
Well-
tell me if I'm wrong, that the reliability is less.
yes. I think we can use accuracy and reliability as rough synonyms here. So I do believe that his estimates in present value terms become less reliable and less accurate. But his errors, if any, in the nominal accounts, they could be positive or negative errors. I'm not speaking about any particular bias in what he's done, just the range of plausible conclusions that might be true given the estimates he's provided.
Thank you.
And this is, I think, it becomes obvious on the next slide, but in case I'm wrong about that, the second bullet here where you say, I note for now that Mr. Hutchings' interest rates are based on assumed stock returns. Are you referring to the 60-40 model there?
Yes.
And let's go to the next slide and take us through the figure there, please.
The first point I would like to make based on slide 108 is just what are the magnitudes of the present values at Mr. Hutchings' interest rates versus the Bodway Smart interest rates. So here we see Mr. Hutchings' NCRs converted to present values in two different ways. The blue line shows the conversion based on his present value conversion factors. And the red line is the same. It's his NCRs, but valued at the Bodway Smart present value conversion factors. So evidently, whether the numbers are large or small, they're larger if positive, they're larger under the Hutchings model than the Budway Smart model year by year. And those differences between our present value approaches are larger in the earlier years.
And the, whenever you say the Bodway Smart model, you're talking about long-term bond rate model.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
So that's the first point, is just how big, what is the magnitude of the differences? And so what I wish to emphasize here that a 60-40 model, as Mr. Marcelo described the Hutchings approach, coupled with the particular assumptions about risk premiums that he has made, the higher returns on the risky stock investments, only amounts to a few percent or less than 1% in many cases in the annual rate of interest that he's assuming. But these differences compound and get magnified over time. And so they result in very large differences in present value dollar amounts. And that the result of that is that these early years have a lot of leverage here. I've used this term in the report, and I think in the demonstratives, leverage just to mean the early years matter a lot. They have a disproportional weight in the final calculation under the Hutchings approach. To illustrate that, I mean, that's evident, I think, in just looking at the figure depicted on slide 108. You can see that there's a few years before 1900 that contribute a lot of present value dollars. In particular, it's a year in the early 1870s, that 1 year alone is valued at more than $4 billion in present value NCRs in the Hutchings accounts. That's what the 4,000, I'm talking about the very high blue spike on the blue line in the 1870s. That spike is around 4,000 on the scale of the graph. 4,000 here means $4 billion in the year 2020.
I mean, essentially, you're repeating what we have heard throughout, that very small differences in the interest rates has enormous impact on the numbers.
Right now, Your Honor, I think I'm just saying these numbers are big.
Day 35 of trial, these numbers are big.
That's why you need an economic expert.
We have a few, don't worry.
But the second point is about sensitivity here. So in the very bottom of this slide, I've added a footnote to say, what are the implications of that? We can take the 7 largest years, all of which occurred before the year 1900 in Mr. Hutchings' present value NCR accounts. Those 7 largest years add up to $13.8 billion in present value out of the $56.9 billion total.
I wonder if I might ask for a point of clarification. This calculation, is it assuming the 7.2% blended 60-40 rate, or is it just stock market rates, or what are you trying to capture here? If you don't mind me asking the question.
I presumed it was a 7.2, but maybe you can tell us.
I thought I set that up apparently not well enough.
I just want to be clear that what we're talking apples and apples.
Okay, go ahead, sir.
It's the 60-40 rate. I'm not capturing anything. I'm just reporting Mr. Hutchings' data.
Okay.
Were you finished with this? Slide?
I don't think I am, but others may disagree. What about these 7 years? It's roughly 25% out of the 170 years. Those 7 years contribute almost 25% of the present value. Could be right or wrong. I'm not alleging that it's wrong. To get those $13.8 billion in present value, Mr. Hutchings is valuing nominal NCRs for those years that amount to $381,000 nominal dollars. Again, nominal values are not meaningful. I'm not trying to assign an economic meaning for us today to $381,000. Just trying to emphasize how high these conversion factors are. And so that any, as I said before, any particular difference in calculations that would lead us to move that nominal amount by some small and entirely plausible delta change of say $1,000 would manifest itself in a very large change in the present values today. And so I'm simply making the point again that these high conversion factors should reduce our confidence, not in necessarily that Mr. Hutchings' approach is correct or not, but how close he gets to the right value through his techniques. Could be too high or too low, but the range of plausible too highs and too lows gets larger the higher one's conversion factors.
So let me see if I'm trying to link these 2 points. You say, if you take the 7 largest years before 1900, they add up to, I think with Mr. Hutchings' model, 13.8 billion in present value.
Yes.
Okay, and so then if you take it at the long-term bond rate model, it's, or just to point out that started out as $381,000.
Yes.
And so the point you're making is by using a high rate, it gets to what you call big numbers, we should come to conclusions about accuracy. And
Yep.
you say that is a reason to use a lower rate? Because I thought you started out by saying there's a reason to use the long-term bond rate, and that had things to, and those reasons were based in what rational people do or with respect to risk. But now is the reason to use a lower rate for accuracy? I just was trying to figure out if we moved from one topic to another.
So, Your Honor, I would not go so far as to say it's a reason to use a lower rate. However, I think it's an important qualification that should be added to the estimates that all the economic experts are providing here. As an academic economist, my standard practice, and I believe best practice, is to report in my quantitative work, to report my best estimate first. This is what I think it is. And then report my degree of confidence that that number that I've estimated is in fact the truth. We call it a confidence interval. And it's standard practice for us to report a point estimate, our best estimate, and then a confidence interval around it where we think, well, it could be wrong, but it's going to be, we have high confidence it will be in the following range of possible, the truth will be in the following range of possible values. In this case, neither Mr. Hutchings nor I can do that in a formal sense of showing you a confidence band around our estimate. But we must be aware of these issues of confidence when we talk about our results. I'm attempting to bring this issue of the degree of confidence that the numbers we're reporting are in fact the truth into the court's thinking about this case. Again, based on standard academic economic principles. And as they say, your mileage may vary.
Thank you.
All right, now let's go to the, unsurprisingly, the next slide. And you address here, you begin to address here errors that, in your opinion, Mr. Hutchings made, and you turn, I think, first when you get into the substance to a Government of Ontario bond issue, particularly between 1900 and 1913. But I'm not going to preempt anything you wish to say. So why don't you just walk us through this slide as you wish.
Sure, slide 109. So now we're back to the nuts and bolts of calculations for a brief period. So I've tried to suggest that the interest rates are very important in this case, suggested it again and again in different ways. Evidently, it's important to get those interest rates correct. And I'd like to make one point about the way Mr. Hutchings arrives at his rates, which I do not think is correct. He calculates, so in his 60-40 model, what's he calculating? Here's a quotation from his demonstratives. He calculates, quote, the rate of return on a specified risk-free security plus a risk premium, right? So the risk premium is the stock return portion, the 60. But all of it, the full 100% is based on an underlying estimate of the risk-free return. I want to leave it to Professor Bodway to talk about the risk premium and the problems with that, why we believe he has misapplied the risk premium in his analysis, and then instead just focus here on what I believe is an error in his risk-free rate of return for the years 1900 to 1913. So what does he use for a risk-free security? He states, quote, for our risk-free security, we use the return to long-term Canada bonds. So he says he's doing the same thing as us for the risk-free rate, but he notes in his testimony that in practice, he substitutes the rate of return on Government of Ontario bonds, which earned higher rates of return than Canada's, for the years 1900 through 1913. So, in my opinion, that's an error. He says he wants to use Canada returns. Canada returns were available to him, but instead he substituted Ontario returns. In my opinion, that's an error. And it would be better economically to use Canada's to construct this risk-free rate of return. To check on whether this is an important thing to talk about or not, I calculated the impact of that change, those years 1900 to 1913 alone, on his NCRs. I estimate that if he did use Canada returns in those years, his NCRs would fall by 3.2% in present value, and that would amount to $1.8 billion.
Of the 56.9 billion?
Yes, of the 56.9 billion.
Now, going to the next slide, you move into more detail concerning this Ontario bond issue. Let's go through that, please.
So it is true that provincial bond returns are generally higher than Government of Canada bond returns. That's true today to some degree. It's even more true in the past. The main economic reasons for this spread, as we call it, between provincial bonds and Government of Canada bonds of the same maturity. I think there are two main reasons. The first is that provincial bonds are perceived by the market as being at greater risk of default. There is built into the return that investors demand a default risk premium. I can buy that provincial bond, but there's some chance I won't actually get paid back because that government will default on its obligation. The second reason why economists believe that there's a spread and provincial returns are higher is that provincial markets are often less liquid. Liquid means liquidity of a bond market is a measure of the number of traders in that market who are buying or selling at any given point in time. Provincial bond markets tend to be less liquid. They have fewer traders, and that creates a risk for investors as well.
You mean if you smell trouble, it's harder to get rid of?
Well, for whatever reason you want to sell, you may not find a willing purchaser at that time if it's a market in which there tend not to be a lot of traders around. That's illiquidity, and it does create this risk that you can't trade when you want to trade, and you can't convert that piece of paper, that bond certificate, into cash. So, in my opinion, both of these factors are at play here to explain why in the early 20th century, Ontario returns were higher than Canada's. Both the perceived default risk and the liquidity risk factors explain the spread that existed then. The reason I think that really relate to the fact that Ontario just had not issued, there were not a lot of outstanding Government of Canada bonds in the early 20th century. So because few bonds were trading in the market, and the market here really is the London market, all Canadian sovereign debt at that time was issued in London and traded among British investors or other investors that traded in the London market. We didn't have a capital market here in Canada really before World War I for anything other than small transactional amounts of various kinds. So we're talking about the London market. There were not a lot of Ontario bonds trading in the London market in that period because Ontario had not been issuing bonds. Ontario didn't need to borrow in the late 19th and early 20th century to any great degree. The first issuance was a railway bond in 1902, the first issuance, I believe, since 1867 by the province of Ontario. That being said, my certainty about no issuance of long-term bonds since Confederation is not complete. Okay, so there were not a lot of bonds. That meant that investors in London were just not familiar with Ontario's, might have had difficulty assessing default risk. And it's reasonable to think that there was not a lot of liquidity. So in that period, greater risks and greater returns on Ontario bonds. On average, well, not on average, year by year, the returns that we can measure on the Ontario bonds were between 0.6% and 0.8% higher than the corresponding returns on Canada's. That's a small difference. In the slide I wrote 60 to 80 basis points. Basis point is 1/100%. But interest rates were low then. So it's a 20% difference in the interest rate that goes into the account for those years, into the Hutchings NCR present value account. And it's not just those years. Interest rates compound over time, evidently. And so the interest rates used in those years affect the present value of all the amounts from 1850 up to 1932.
And going over to slide 111, you then get into something Mr. Hutchings said in his testimony, and you reference his demonstrative number 215. Can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, so the question is, should Mr. Hutchings have used the Ontario bond returns in that period? So I looked at what he said about why he did that. He stated that he used, quote, Ontario bonds when academic research recommends using Ontario bonds. That's from slide 215 of the demonstratives. He didn't specify what that source was, but I believe that his academic research source is a particular book that he cited and that we cited in our reports that was first published in the year 1977. The authors are Homer and Scylla. The footline gives you the references that I think that he's talking about and that I'm now going to talk about. And if you read what that book says, Homer and Scylla, 1977, it says it recommends the use of Ontario yields, quote, quoting from the book now, when dominions were not available. Dominions means long-term Government of Canada bonds. So the academic research source does recommend using Ontario bonds, important qualifier, when Canada's were not available. The next slide, which I don't think we should go to yet, I'll get confused. We'll show you that quote. So use Ontario's when Canada's are not available. That same source, Homer and Scylla, provides a table of returns that Mr. Hutchings relied on for a number of years. But that table itself includes returns on Canada's for the 1900 to 1913 period. So if the recommendation is to use Ontario's when Canada's are not available, and the same source includes Canada's, I don't think it's a recommendation to use Ontario's for those years. Now, there are no returns quoted in that book for Canada's in 1914 through 1919. So I believe what the book was saying was use Ontario's for the years 1914 to 19. And indeed, we used them, as did Mr. Hutchings, for those years. So
You used the Ontario rate for those years, 1914 to 1918?
I believe we did, Your Honor. I did just say exactly that. We used a number of different sources on yields for different years. I haven't reviewed my work papers on that for several months. So I'm pretty sure that it's true that we used Ontario's in those years, but I should check my work papers if it's important.
Thanks.
But if I'm understanding you correctly, using Ontario rates for 1914 to 1919 would fall within the scope of the advice, because the Canada bond rates were not available during those years. Have I got that right?
Certainly not available in that book that Mr. Hutchings was relying on.
And
As far as I
then,
know, not available anywhere else.
and then if you go and maybe, I'm in your hands, obviously, Your Honor, about lunch, but if we go to the next slide, I'm in everybody's hands about lunch. If you go to the next slide, the takeaway line in that, I guess, is sort of in the second line of slide 112. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, if I may, I'll read a few words
Sure.
from this quotation I provided from the Homer and Silla, the academic research source, but not all of them by any means. So, but this is all of the context, I think, behind what Mr. Hutchings said. It starts off by saying that this is about the use of Province of Ontario bond yields as a substitute for Dominion bond yields. It says that's a reasonable thing, potentially a reasonable thing. Second sentence, quote, in years when both were available, the difference was rarely large. And I'm not going to read the next few words to the end of the sentence. Indeed, I don't think I want to read any more words, but I'd like to offer an interpretation while pausing long enough that anyone who wants to ask questions or.
Go ahead.
Okay, so what I think they're saying here is it's appropriate to use Ontario yields when Canada's are not available. And the evidence for that is that the yields on the two, when we have both of the yields on Ontario's and Canada's, they're quite similar. And then the table, which occurs in the same book just a few pages prior, includes these average yields or returns on Ontario's and Canada's year by year, side by side, for the years 1900 to 1913. So I think the Ontario yields are in the table for those years in order to support the statement in the book that it would be appropriate to use Ontario yields when Canada's are not available, because when we have them both, they look pretty similar from the point of view of those authors. So I think it's possible that Mr. Hutchings just misread the table and didn't see that they were providing those Ontario yields for those years to support this statement that when Canada's are not available, it would be appropriate to use Ontario yields. That's my guess.
But again, your point from a slide earlier, I took it was that even these incremental differences, when brought forward, turn into large sums of money.
Yes, well, the actual difference is, as I said before, between 0.6 percentage points and 0.8 percentage points year by year. And in some contexts, that would be small, as these authors say, that spread between them would be small. But in our context, in this matter, it magnifies into a very large difference.
Your Honor, that's the end of a section. We would be moving now into a discussion of the annuities model. Is this a good time for?
I think it's a good time for lunch.
Thank you, Professor. We're going to go over until
What do we say? 2:15, does that? 2:15?
All right.
Thank you all.
This will recess until 2:50.